Welcome back to Mom and Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. In this episode, I am talking with Erin Spahr, and we are getting into what is feminism and motherhood and how to understand how some of the ways that we might have understood feminism might not actually be how modern feminism is looked at, and the ways that looking through a feminist lens can both support moms and partners through this time of perinatal mental health. Erin Spahr is a licensed therapist, mother, feminist, podcast host, and maternal mental health advocate based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. She uses a feminist lens in her work with mothers and strives to help mothers free themselves from oppressive societal expectations and find more self confidence and self compassion. She hosts the Feminist Mom podcast, where she discusses the intersection of feminism and motherhood with inspiring guests. She also has an inclusive provider directory that serves as a vital link in connecting mothers, birthing individuals, and families in the United States and Canada with perinatal providers who provide inclusivity and identity affirming care. So let's dive into this important conversation with Erin. Welcome, Erin. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Kat. This is great.
Yes, I'm happy we finally get to have a chat. And for you to be able to talk about the work that you do, and yeah, I'd love for you to start there. How did you get into what got you interested in and motivated to talk about feminism and motherhood?
Yeah, so the feminism came later. I definitely have had like a social justice lens for a long time. In college, I pursued like a minor in sociology, and I really loved all my sociology classes, actually more than the psychology classes, just because I felt like they were so important to really look at the societal ways that we're all kind of like put into these different boxes and
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
those boxes are stratified and how much privilege or how much hardship you experience based on different identities. So I found that to be really interesting,
Hmm.
much more like sort of long time ago, and carried that with me. And then as I became a therapist, I was actually really interested in working with trauma, um, sort of just general trauma, and was working in sort of a inner city academic institution that like really kind of worked with a community-based population. So I was seeing a lot of folks with trauma, but all kinds of other issues, so pretty general. And about a year into that, I became a mom. So I was only a therapist for a short
Hmm.
period of time
Hmm.
before entering motherhood. And I think a lot of folks, not everyone, but a lot of folks who enter this field have some experience with motherhood and that shape us. And I
For sure.
distinctly remember like that first, like, I mean, I was gonna say like the first night when I came home and just being like, how the heck does anyone do this? How
Hmm.
like it's
Hmm.
like you're joining this like club that you didn't realize was
Hmm.
there,
Hmm.
that from the
Yeah.
outside looked totally different than when it's like on the inside.
Hmm.
And I remember being like very aware of like the privileges and the just the resources that I had, both like the like internal resources and external
Mm.
resources. And I was like, how does someone without that, deal with motherhood, deal with, that, especially that postpartum period. But even if I think back to like my pregnancy, I remember starting to getting pretty activated about like how people treated me, how people felt so comfortable talking about my body, pointing at my body, asking me invasive questions,
Mhm,
touching me.
mhm,
How I remember being aware of like having to work through pretty awful morning sickness, morning in quotes, right? It was all day sickness, and having to just show up and pretend that I was fine and feeling angry about that, and feeling like that I
yeah,
didn't have any other choices. And the maternity leave was really hard. I didn't really have, I was lucky because I had the 12 weeks of FMLA, and I
mm.
put together like, my PTO and a couple weeks of like
Mhm,
short-term disability, right? Like the way that so many parents, moms in particular, have to deal with. And so I became angry, frustrated with
yeah,
a lot of these things that I was experiencing. And then of course, um, started to, be interested in this world, and I ended up like working with moms and I was at an academic institution, and I started a clinic there for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and
That's
just
great.
because I was interested in it and they were like, sure, go for it. And I started to get that experience, and then of course went through like the PSI training. And so I've just kind of over time just kept leaning into this population. um, and we can talk more about the feminism of it all, but that really came from continuing to sit with mothers and seeing really similar stories, really similar
Mm,
patterns, and asking a lot of questions about how we treat mothers, how we treat women, and so yeah, we can probably get into all of that.
mhm.
But
Yes,
um, yes, that's how it started.
we will get into that. That's great. Thank you for that. I would love for, for people who are just like trying to understand what feminism means or don't quite. If you could kind of clear that up for us, because I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of misconceptions about what feminism is and what it
Yeah.
isn't. So if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So feminism is like it's like a movement, right? That has a history, and over time we think about the way feminism has shifted in waves. So there's
Mhm.
different waves of feminism, and at different times, they're all pretty much focused on liberation and equality for all genders. So the
Mhm.
idea that no matter your sex, no matter your gender, you have the same access to opportunities. And, I think a lot of us grew up with kind of the, I don't know, 90s, 2000s, kind of like um, girl boss feminism, the sort of, I think, Spice Girls feminism, the sort of like, you can do anything, you can be anything, right? Which is not necessarily what our mothers and grandmothers had, right? They didn't
Right,
have as much access. Like we know that many folks, people didn't get a credit card or didn't have access to credit cards or employment opportunities or buying a house till not that long ago.
right.
And so, like, our generation growing up, like, had more of those opportunities, but we were trying to compete with men. And, there was a lot of this like rising up and girl power. And I think a lot of people still think that's what feminism is, and that's kind of where it ended.
Mm,
But it's really changed, and we had now kind of think about not just kind of like trying to like win in a male dominated society, but we're focusing on how feminism should be intersectional. So thinking about what people's identities are and how that interacts with their experience as a whatever gender they are.
mhm,
Meaning, like, if you are a Black woman, how is your experience maybe different than like a Latina woman, or if you are cisgendered versus LGBTQ, like queer, how is your experience, right? So we're trying to look at all of these different intersecting identities and trying to create equality, trying to give everyone like sort of the same um, opportunities. And that doesn't always look the same because there are differences. And this is where I actually am a huge fan of mattress centric feminism. So when I think about feminism with mothers, I think of mattress centric feminism, which is coined by Dr. Andrea O'Reilly, who's like the mother of motherhood studies. And this is a particular feminism where it like focuses on the needs that mothers have that are unique. And I think this is where a lot of mothers get confused about feminism,
mm,
because they think, or we've been taught, that to be a feminist means you need to go out and work, means you need to like do everything a man can do,
right.
and often has made us feel like we had to deny our motherhood
Mhm,
um, in a lot of ways. And I think that has been one way that some women have gotten ahead, right? By having access to contraception, having the choice to not be mothers meant that they had certain experiences or certain opportunities. But the problem is that we need mothers,
mhm,
and there are a lot of people who want to be mothers. And a big part I know of my own experience was feeling like when I became a mother, I feel like I lost privileges
Mm,
in our society. I felt like I had
mhm,
less choices
mhm,
than I did before. I felt like I had yeah, just like less freedom. And I
mhm,
think, a lot of women feel that way. And I think contributes to our symptoms like postpartum is feeling
mhm,
like, wait a second, like I don't have the same opportunities to like go leave the house or and we can talk about all the ways that the system
mhm,
makes that harder as well as the values, the cultural norms that we have. So that's feminism's trying to advocate for um, sort of a more like equal, liberated culture for
mhm.
men and women.
So that sounds great. Um, love it. And there are people who are, if we can speak to this for a minute, people who think like feminism is bad.
Yeah.
And so what are I'm not talking about like the examples that you just gave that, feminism means I can't just be a mom or a stay-at-home mom. Um, I'm talking about people who are like
Yes.
anti-feminism. What are those arguments or some of them if you can, just so I can get a broad spectrum of like why are people tripping out about this?
Yeah, I think a lot of I mean, there is a movement right now, I think, of anti-feminism. If you think about maybe folks who are on social media might know about like trad wives, right? So this is like someone who identifies as a traditional woman, and it feels like feminism is somehow anti-family, anti-traditional roles, and some people feel threatened by that or feel like this works. Like the role that men have and the role that women have had traditionally is the right way. And so when we're feminism is like saying, well, we could have different options, we can have more choices. I think sometimes people hear that there's only one choice versus
Oh.
like, we're not saying that having traditional gender roles is bad. That
Mhm,
is that is fine if that works, but we should interrogate them,
mhm,
right, and sort of offer different opportunities, right. I also think that a lot of people don't, like I said, don't really understand how feminism has changed. I've
mm,
talked to some women who feel like when what they still see and what I think a lot of like businesses have capitalized on this idea of feminism, and sort of like, yeah, put girl power on it and really water down what feminism is supposed to be
mhm,
and make it seem like um it's like this like cute trendy thing to be when I think it's really like a serious like um like movement to try to progress our society. And I think a lot of folks don't feel that connection. I think also I've talked to some folks who I think they're really mad at the patriarchy or they're mad at capitalism, but instead it's like feminism gets blamed. Like like there's these jokes about thanks feminism for sending women now are working and we're tired because we're
oh,
burnt
oh,
out,
I
right?
see, uh-huh,
Right?
mhm,
Like sort of feminism gave us the opportunity to go out to work and it's like great, well, now I'm burnt out because I'm working and I have a kid and I
mm,
have all
mm,
of this, right? People are tired, they're burnt out.
yeah,
It feels like feminism failed, right? And I think we can also look at that critically and think about why has feminism not gone as far as we need it to go. Part of that is because we haven't changed the structures to support some of
mhm,
these supposed freedoms, right? They're in name in a lot of ways. Yes, you can go out and work, but we're not going to actually change the school day or the work week to make this work. So there's a lot of tension in the fact that we're not done yet, right?
mhm,
And people, I
mhm.
think, see feminism as failing them in certain ways.
Interesting. Okay, so like, failing is one argument, a threat is another. So
Mhm.
somehow that it's a threat. But as I understand, what you're saying is that everything is welcome. Everything is allowed in feminism. It's not. Uh, it doesn't have this like narrow track. Uh,
Yeah, I
uh,
think we want to think about what choices you have available because some people say, well, we the point is choice, and it's not fully choice. It's really about um like opportunity. And so if it's like, well, you can either choose to stay home and have no power, and your partner goes out to work, goes out and makes all the money, and you choose that life, but you don't really have any other options, like aside from working really hard and then having to send your kid to daycare that you don't want them to go, when the choices aren't great, that that's why I think sometimes people say, well, they chose that, they chose this. I think this idea of choice is
Mm.
sometimes like um not actually there. Like, I think that we don't actually have the choices that we think we have. We could have other choices. If
Mm.
feminism was more successful, we could have more choices. The choices aren't always great. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And it makes me think a little bit of, um, in some ways, anyways, in like US culture, I can't really speak for anywhere else, but this, like the pressure is on the individual. It's not on the collective.
Yeah, yes,
The
exactly.
the and the blame is on the individual, not on the collective. It's so if it's going wrong, it's because you're doing the wrong thing. And I mean, you were saying that earlier, that the systems need to change, but so there's this like cultural undertone of how we're just, we're the pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of whatever mentality. I still don't know what that means, but um, as opposed to like, eh, if we had community and we thought of things in a community based way,
Yeah,
communal way, um, things might be a little easier. Not that that's some like magic thing that would fix all
right.
society's ails, but there is a way that the individual is blamed in a way that's just
Mhm.
not fair at its base.
Yeah, I think of that as like the hyper individualism as a societal value, like
Hmm.
you're saying. And yeah, collectivism, like other cultures that have a more collectivist sort of approach where, yeah, like everybody in the community or the family is like feels responsible. Could you
Hmm.
imagine like if, you know, neighbors felt responsible for helping to create the next generation? Like
Hmm.
if you felt, like
Hmm.
that is something that so many people are thinking like missing this
Hmm.
village
Hmm.
idea.
Hmm. Hmm.
But we're pretty far from that, like in a
Hmm.
lot of
Yeah,
ways. And I think
yeah.
people are so scared to give up that sense of independence because it's such a value,
Right.
right? So, and we know that like when you have a family, we need other people. And
Hmm.
it's so scary, I think, for a lot of people to need support and need yeah, people. So, yeah, you're right. Everyone's kind of in their own homes like feeling like they're somehow failing this really hard task.
Yeah, and you were talking, going back to the kind of structures and systems in place. I mean, these are the societal, some of the societal impacts. What do you see as impacting motherhood?
I think mothers are burnt out. I think
Mhm.
just like a baseline, let alone, adding in, like PMADs,
Mhm.
perinatal mood and anxiety disorders or trauma. I think just like on baseline a lot. And we know that because there was a recent US Attorney General report about how parents are burnout, or half of them are overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And I think we know mothers really, I think, are bearing the brunt of it because mothers are still doing the bulk of the care work, a bulk of the, carrying bulk of the mental load in the household. So yeah, I think that a lot of mothers are just feeling overwhelmed. We also are in a time where the expectations for parenting has never been higher in
Mhm.
the history of people.
Mhm.
Never been higher. Like it's not enough to just put food on the table and clothes on your kid's back. We are tasked with their mental health.
Mhm.
We are, tasked with their social, how's my kid's social life doing?
Right, right.
We feel pressure to be their playmates. We there and there's a lot of great research developments. It's good that we understand like the emotional psychological, needs of our kids, and that's good, but we don't have the structural support to do all of the work that we now really are starting to recognize that goes into parenting,
Yeah.
right? Like parents, there's this like kind of movement to also try to pay caregivers, right? This has been unpaid work for so
Mhm.
long, and part
Mhm.
of this individualism, as you mentioned, is like, well, this was your choice, this
Mm.
was your decision to have a kid, now like this is on you, rather than thinking about, yeah, how could we restructure, the way that we work and live. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but the weekend, like this like 2-day weekend thing is just like a failed experiment,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like we don't most of us don't have, time to do all the things that we need to do and fit in leisure time and family time and like
Mhm.
chores and whatever
Mhm.
into these
Mhm.
2 days, and then be speeding around for 5 days a week.
Mhm.
That's not, I don't think that's working,
Right.
from a
There's not a whole lot of rest happening.
none. Yeah. So, I think a lot of parents that are having to make choices about what things they can be good at and what things they're gonna maybe feel like they're failing.
Mhm.
And my message is you're not alone.
Mhm.
That's part of this collective problem that we are having right now, which I know is kind of a downer message, but I think it's
It's
hopefully
real.
validating. Yeah, hopefully it's validating.
Yeah, for sure it is. I think most people, again, all these things sort of get like titrated down to the individual. They're not at home thinking like, "Whoop, society's really like missed the mark on this one. It's failing us today." Whatever. It just feels bad and feels like it's my fault. I'm doing something wrong. I'm a bad mom because I can't do all these 5 million things, and the context is lost on
Mhm.
most people because I mean you're home or you're at work or
You're in
whatever.
it.
You're doing your thing, and there's not a lot of time to reflect. There's not a lot of time to wonder about why do I feel this way. It just because our brains do what they do and society does what it does. It just feels
Mhm.
like I'm bad. Um, I'm not doing enough, and the amount of pressure on one person is, of course, people are burnt out. I mean, all parents are burnt out for sure, but the when we're talking about the mom, um, in her experience is largely feeling like everything's her fault. Everything bad is her fault.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we can go into the psychological level there. What, from like an attachment perspective, right? A lot of us learn to adapt by trying to feel in control. And
Hmm.
so if I blame myself, then maybe I can do better. Maybe I can
Hmm.
beat myself up enough and
Hmm.
I'll get it right. I think a lot of people have internalized that rather than, like thinking that they don't have that kind of control or that they should ask for help. Somebody else could sort of get involved. Like a lot of us learned to kind of handle our problems on our own,
Hmm.
especially if like you come from a family that that didn't sort of offer a lot of safety or emotional like yeah, closeness, security. So I think, yeah, like it's a lot of us are used to saying, well, what's wrong with me, or um and I think when you're a therapist and you see these patterns over and over again, you hear like similar stories,
All the time.
it's a lot easier for us to kind of zoom out and say, okay, this is not just you, this
Hmm.
is happening all over, and there's something wrong here in the way that we're
Hmm.
treating moms in particular.
No doubt. Yeah, it's so common. It's really it's heartbreaking, actually. I mean, it's so stressful to have to figure all of this out on your own and to not feel like you have the adequate support. Yeah, in terms of like the using a feminist lens, on this, what would be um, the fix? If you could paint a picture of how best to support moms from a feminist lens, through a feminist
Mhm.
lens, what would that look like?
So I think, like you mentioned, we need to sort of look at this at different levels. So there's the individual level, and then there's like the relationship level, and there's like the collective. So I think ideally, we would be working on this from a collective systemic place where we would, um, again, create the structures to support parents. So that means having affordable childcare. That means having um, paid parental leave that is similar to how it is in the rest of the world. That we would have more flexible workplaces. That we would Right, so create those structures, pay parents, pay if you're a stay-at-home mother, you should have something to protect you financially so that you are not sacrificing your like future wealth and ability to leave a potential relationship. If it's I see that all of the time.
Mhm.
It's a really serious problem, because I understand for some folks who want to be stay-at-home mothers, that's such something they really want, but they are not necessarily going to be safe if they're in a relationship where they need to leave, if they're not getting income, right? So
Right.
we should have, I mean, I think there are solutions that people can do now to kind of, when you get have that arrangement, making sure that you're putting money into an account for yourself or having retirement benefits, like figure it out. Like, so I think there are ways we can do that. But I think culturally, we also just need to kind of be prioritizing mothers and sort of seeing the role that we're doing as super important work. Right now, it's
Yep.
like this, it's invisible. It's just like you just do it, right? It's like, oh, like the good woman, the good mother, the good wife, she just like does it, she doesn't complain. So that's the cultural values part, and that's the
Mm.
feminism part too,
Mhm.
which I often help from an individual level help women really understand like the sort of expectations that they have of themselves
Mhm.
and that others have of them, and to liberate themselves from that, from like an
Mhm.
emotional place, right? Where did I learn how to be a good mom? What are the messages that I've been taught? To sacrifice myself, to be a martyr, to never complain, to not take up space, to care for everyone else, right? And like seeing how is that affecting me? How is that, and to be able to decide, you know what, that's not that's coming from the culture. That's coming from a society that
Mhm.
says women in general should be kept small, should not take up space, right? And we can also kind of extrapolate that back to our childhoods, being girls, being teenagers, right? Like gosh, there's a lot there. We've
Mhm.
been kind of trained our whole lives to kind of be in this position of not having our needs met. Um, and so from an individual level, there's a lot you can do to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore.
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
going to, make the best choices I can. These are the things that I'm going to put my energy towards, but these are the things I'm not. I'm going to embrace rest. I'm going to embrace joy. I'm going to teach my kids how to clean up around the house and make that the expectation, right? There's a lot of parents who are trying to like parent the next generation
Mhm.
differently.
Mhm.
I have 2 boys, and so, like, what I'm modeling for them as their mom, what kinds of expectations I have of them that are different than I think past generations. There's a lot that we can do when we're really aware of these
Mhm.
cultural
Mhm.
messages. And another piece of it, which is something that I've been thinking about recently, is fathers,
Mhm.
like, ideally, we'd have a more collective support system, but a lot of us are just in relationships. So if you're partnered with a man, I think women are thinking about this stuff more. They're in therapy more.
Mhm.
There's a lot of parenting accounts, and they're
Mhm.
listening to you. You're listening to this stuff. They're thinking about stuff. I don't
Mhm.
think men have as many spaces
Mhm.
to be thinking about like how the patriarchy has impacted them,
Right.
how they have internalized ideas about their worth being about going to work and a
Right.
career
Right.
rather than being a caretaker or being a partner. So that's something I've become more interested in is because I think women are getting really tired of expressing their frustrations. And I know listeners might recognize this in their own relationships if they're in relationships where there are, a lot of women are carrying the mental load, and a lot of
Mhm.
women are doing more and are feeling frustrated, especially as the uh like expectations have just increased, and men are doing more than their dads and grandfathers, but there's still this like mismatch, and a lot
Mhm.
of couples are struggling. So I'm really interested in thinking about kind of how men can kind of catch up a bit to some of the things that I think women have been socialized to do and men haven't. And that's a problem of feminism, is like we haven't done a good job of figuring out how men can get on board. I don't think a lot of men see themselves in, and we need them, right? To do this.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned patriarchy and patriarchal structures. If you can, again, like I'm kind of um, thinking of the person who might not
Yeah.
understand what that means. Can you give like a little brief explanation?
Yeah. So the patriarchy is basically just this idea that our society has been really set up by men for men. Like
Hmm.
the way that we work, the way that we set up families in really big ways and subtle ways.
Hmm.
Um, and like thinking about like the systems, like the medical system. A lot of women, for example, often feel dismissed when they go to the doctor and they report their symptoms because, oh wait, we just started to realize that like tampons were only studied with water. We just found out like the first time they just started testing it with blood. Or we that your seatbelt is actually tested on a man. The way that the seatbelt works, it doesn't actually work for a lot of women's bodies. And there's a lot of ways that are subtle ways and big ways that women have not been kind of like prioritized. And so it's a man's world in that way, and in a lot of ways we've gained rights, but and especially as we have more women in power who
Hmm.
like help make those choices, it's shifted, but you can still see a lot of our values are about dominance, which is something like a patriarchal idea. Dominance, aggression, competition. These are
Hmm.
kind of values. So it's not about men being bad and women being good. I think that that's a misconception.
Hmm.
And it's more about the way that we have like the values that we have and the structures we have are sort of revolved around these kind of masculine patriarchal ideals. And we want to they don't work for everybody, you
Right.
know?
Well, right. And to what you were saying before, also are not very supportive of men.
That yeah, they hurt men too,
Hmm.
exactly. Men
Hmm.
can't talk about their feelings, right? Because of stoicism, and you need to be a man is to be strong, not weak, right? Like,
Yeah. Ugh.
sad.
It is sad. It is really sad. Um, I noticed it so clearly after I had my son, um, and realized for him anyways, how important it was for him to have to be like emotionally supported and
Mhm,
validated, and how important it was for him to have like hugs. He's a very huggy kid, and still is, thankfully. I'm like, I hope that lasts
yeah,
forever. But it was the first time I had really been confronted with how much I had internalized about men, and like messaging I got from my own dad about how men are, and those kinds of things.
mhm,
And I was like, there's this little a human who is a boy and who's like showing me that he's not those things.
mhm,
And how sad it was as I watched him develop and grow, how sad it was to think of like, wow, I wonder how many boys are just conditioned out of their depth of feeling, their emotional connectivity. their intuition, like all of these
Yeah.
things. And it does a disservice to men, it does a disservice to women and relationships, everybody really. I'm sure just so many ways it does a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, and they actually I think research shows that boys are, like, born more sensitive.
Mhm.
That I don't know why, like, there's ideas about that, but a lot of boys are more sensitive, and this idea is that, like, patriarchy kind of teaches boys to kinda shut down these parts
Yeah.
of themselves, and it's something I really struggle with as a mom of 2 boys. I have a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I talk a lot with my husband about, like, I feel like he has more power than I do to
Mhm.
model certain things because we value masculine, you think about, like, little boys look up to boy superheroes,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
girls are allowed to look up to boy superheroes, but,
Mhm.
like, to look at girls and sort of
Mhm.
admire girls is not it's not the same in our society, and so in
Right.
some ways, like, what my husband does, I tell him, like, "You have a lot of power to model, whatever it is that we wanna model here,"
Mhm. Mhm.
And that can be frustrating as a mom because I
Oh, sure.
want
Mhm.
I wanna have that control, but you see how just his peers, like,
Oh, yeah,
how
no doubt.
oh my gosh, they indoctrinate each other
Yes.
into
Yes.
masculinity, and masculinity itself isn't bad, right? But
Oh, no,
it's
yeah. Well,
yeah, but, like,
but we all have
shutting off
masculine and feminine parts of yes.
yeah. Yeah, but it's like shutting off, devaluing of the feminine because that's not seen as strong or
Right.
that makes me sad.
It is really sad. I mean, how do you what are your thoughts on how all of this is impacting mothering?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of first of all, again, it's a lot of pressure because I
Mm.
think mothers, again, not were the expectations of idea, this like um what was the word? Sorry. Intensive mothering.
Mhm.
This intensive mothering time we're in, like, moms are worrying about that. They ask
Mhm.
me about that, like,
Mhm.
"How do I raise sons who are gonna defy the patriarchy?" It's like, gosh, that's, like, a lot of pressure, like, moms
Right.
are wanting to break cycles,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so many cycle breakers who are trying, and I think the pressure feels really high. I think in that way, we have to take some of the pressure off because
Mm.
we have some control, but we can't control everything, right? And we're I think the goal is we want to turn the needle just like a little bit
Mhm. Mhm.
gradually,
Mhm.
in the direction we want to go, but recognize we can't break every cycle. So, I mean, I think just sort of for this generation of parents, like recognizing like you're gonna do a good enough job, right?
Mhm.
We don't need to do an amazing, perfect job. You can't get it all right, but I feel like this generation, if we know how to repair, we know how to, like, apologize to our
Mm.
kids
Mm.
when we mess up,
Mhm.
that let's just do that. Let's like, this generation, I think it just has all these experts, like, telling them the right thing to do and the right thing to feed their kids and the
It's a
right thing
lot.
to it's too much. So, if you can just, like, re apologize, I think that's good. I focus on that with my kids a lot, helping
Mhm.
them apologize to each other and be able
Mhm.
to do the repair well and
Mhm.
like, like that will be a legacy that I think would be enough, just to be able to do that. So, I don't know, take the pressure off of what you can control and trust in your kid too, trust in
Mhm.
yourself. Those
Mhm.
are the kinds of things that I think we need more to
It
hear
is
more.
so hard with I mean we hear this and see this a lot, but the social media is good for some things for sure. And it's also it can be really confusing place where
Yeah.
you are getting so many messages about what's right. And it's hard to know, like, is that what well is that thing that this person talking about, was that right for them and their kid, or is it
Yeah.
right for all kids? Probably not. um because kids are more nuanced than that, or whatever. Like, there's a lot of parenting advice and body advice and mental health advice even, and there's so much to weed through. That if you're going to be a participant in social media, you you have to also figure out how to filter some of it,
Filter. Yeah.
or else you'll just be pulled every direction. Well, I think a lot of it is meant to like give information or to help people feel empowered and all of that. But in a
Mhm,
sense, it's leaving people feeling paralyzed by too many things to decide from and think through. And um, yeah, it's just one of those ways where I think things like uh, I don't know how to frame it in terms of how like patriarchy and feminism play out on social media. Um, like some of it's empowering, some of it is not.
mhm. Yeah, I think the competitiveness is
Mm,
not helpful, right? This,
mhm.
like, competition feeling, like, we're achievement focused. I get caught up with
Yeah,
that a
yeah.
lot, comparing myself to
Mhm,
someone else. Like, this
mhm,
person has more followers than me, or this
mhm,
person's doing that
mhm,
thing, or as a mom, like, wow, their kids, like, you know, look so well behaved out in public, right? Or,
mhm,
there's all these ways that we measure ourselves. And I
mhm,
think
mhm.
maybe this isn't like patriarchy, but just from a societal perspective, I think a lot of us grew up, and I talked about this a lot, like with more behavioral parenting, right? Like this, you
Right,
did
right, right.
good, you
Yeah,
did
yeah.
bad, you got
Mhm,
this
mhm,
award, you got an
mhm,
A, you got an F. Like
mhm,
a lot of us really looked externally for validation. Am I good enough? I need someone else to tell me that. And so I think again, one thing I see parents doing now is working on build helping other kids build that internal
mhm.
sort of like meter to sort of know. And I think that's what I try to help my clients like figure out,
Right.
is like let's yeah, let's check in on that. Like how do you think you did? How was that? Like what are your values? What's important to you? Right? Because a lot of us weren't really taught to look inside and
Mhm.
evaluate. So I think a lot of us are trying to do this while also trying to teach our kids how to do this, which is why I just like have so much like love and compassion for this generation of parents
Yeah.
who are just like have so much information, want to do better, and again, just like need so much more support. And so in the meantime, if you can get more support, like accept it. Oh my goodness, accept whatever support you can get, but also just have a lot of compassion for yourself. That's really the point of for me of like looking at this cultural stuff is like,
Right.
yeah, you're not failing. Like you're doing a kick-ass job in a
Mhm.
really hard situation and like that matters.
Absolutely. Oh, well, Erin, it was a delight to talk to you, and really appreciate you sharing all of this with everyone. I do think the work that you're doing is really empowering, and it's helping people to kind of really understand more deeply why they feel the way they feel and what they can do to shift.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. I remember when you started this podcast like a long time ago. I was at a PSA conference and got your little like I think it was like a postcard and I remember listening. So this has been going on for such a long time and it's been such a great resource. So this is
Thank you.
such a treat to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Erin. And you guys can connect with her at erinspahrtherapy.com and can also find her on Instagram at Feminist Mom Therapist. Please do make sure you have followed and subscribed the Mom and Mind podcast. We definitely need your support and want to know that you're out there listening in with us and referring people to this podcast. Please share it so that other people know that they are not alone and that perinatal mental health conditions are real and that there's help and they can feel better. It takes all of us to raise our voice so that everybody gets the help that they need. And this podcast and others like it are one sure way to make sure that people know about perinatal mental health. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.